Hello, and welcome to On My Shelf. Today I'm talking about a fantastic middle grade book about the Ukrainian famine in the 1930s. The Lost Year by Catherine Marsh is a dual timeline story about a boy named Matthew who's bored and miserable during the present-day pandemic lockdown, and also about three cousins who lived through the Ukrainian famine in the 1930s. Matthew stumbles upon a black and white photo in his great-grandmother's room that sparks his curiosity about her story. And so begins the story of cousins Helen, Mila, and Nadia. It's set in alternating timelines, and the 1930s timeline takes place in the US and the USSR, detailing the Holodomor. I think that's how you say it. It was a famine that killed millions of Ukrainians that the Soviet government successfully covered up for decades. This story is emotional, compelling, and timely. I read this one to my kids for one of our summer read-alouds, and they were riveted and ready to hear every chapter. Catherine Marsh is also the author of Nowhere Boy, which I've read and also highly recommend, as well as The Night Tourist, The Twilight Prisoner, Jep, Who Defied the Stars, and The Doors by the Staircase. I haven't yet read any of those, but I do plan to. I enjoyed a lot of things about The Lost Year. First, I loved that it was a historical book that also included a modern-day perspective. Matthew, the modern-day kid, was dealing with the lockdown of the pandemic. My kids can relate. He and his mom had arguments. He was bored and miserable, tired of the pandemic, worried. All of these are relatable pieces for kids today. Interspersing those modern-day pieces with the longer historical pieces was brilliant. It provided perspective and also a break in the difficult story of a famine. Also, it connected with kids who still feel the after effects of a pandemic. I didn't think I was ready to read a pandemic book, but this one was just the one I needed. I also loved how the book took an unflinching look at reality. Marsh examined misinformation and how the Soviet government controlled the narrative of the Ukrainian famine in the 1930s. This was a really valuable piece of the book. It's also a valuable piece for readers. They learn to question things, look for reality, use critical thinking in their own lives. Matthew had some great conversations with his dad, who was a journalist, about media literacy. As a former journalist, these were some of my favorite parts of the book. I wanted to read them twice to my kids, but I managed to rein myself in. And the third piece I really enjoyed was Breath of the Wild. My sons love video games, and when the book mentioned Breath of the Wild, they all sat up a little straighter. Even if it's not everyone's video game of choice, they still relate. Here was a kid in a book who played video games. It's a piece of connection, a way for kids to find similarities with the main character. It's relatable. He had his video games taken away for something he did, and one of my sons said, "Hey, that happens to me too." And we all had a laugh about it. From a craft perspective, I enjoyed that The Lost Year had many different perspectives. This story was told from so many different voices and also two different timelines and countries, and that provided rich layers and even some suspense. One voice would end on sort of a cliffhanger, and the story would move on to another's perspective. The modern-day timeline kept modern-day kids connected, and then the historical timelines kept kids riveted and waiting to hear more, knowing that these characters would somehow intersect. But how? Each character had their own arc and their own lesson to learn, and my kids and I never found ourselves getting confused. There is also a really compelling mystery. This was not a mystery book, but it contained a mystery at its heart, and many chapters left questions unfulfilled as characters tried to figure out what was going on. Some are small questions. What is she going to do now that her world has changed? Others were big questions like, why doesn't Gigi want to talk about this? What is she hiding? And the third craft piece I enjoyed was the plot twist. Without giving anything away, this book had a plot twist that I only saw coming from a chapter or two away. I think it surprised most of my kids, which was the goal. And it made total sense when it was revealed, which is the mark of a good plot twist. That's all I'll say about it. If you're dying to know what it is, you'll just have to pick up the book. So here's what we can learn from The Lost Year. Number 1, tie history to modern day. Often, when we write historical books, there are parallels between history and modern day. But what if we employed the technique Marsh used, including a perspective that was also modern day? It won't work for every historical story, but it reminded me to look for those places where we can infuse historical stories with modern perspectives or writings or parallels. It can sometimes make the narrative richer. Or on the other side, what about in our modern day stories? How might we tie history into those? History is cyclical. When we see those connections, it might be fun to include them in our stories. Number 2, find pop culture connections for readers. Just like Marsh used Breath of the Wild to draw in some who may not have given the book another look, we can use pieces of pop culture to draw our readers in too. Of course, the trends change. We read this book just as the newest Zelda game, Tears of the Kingdom, came out. My sons aren't really playing Breath of the Wild anymore, but they do remember it. It reminded me to find interesting ways for my readers to connect with my characters, even though trends change. And know those points of connection, because they'll know it. Trust me, if Marsh had written anything incorrect about Breath of the Wild, my sons would have known it. We have to know about the pop culture we put in our books. But don't let that discourage us from trying. Number 3, keep readers reading with small mysteries. We don't all write mystery stories, but we can all utilize the power of mystery. Leave readers with questions that compel them to keep reading chapter after chapter, if only to find out an answer to their questions. Marsh's technique reminded me to look for those places in my own stories. Secrets my characters may have. Things they don't want anyone else to know. How can we utilize those to make the story more compelling? It's worthwhile not to tie everything up immediately after a problem or a question is introduced, but keep readers hanging on for a chapter or two, or several. A reader wanting to know more is a reader who won't be able to put the book down. Or they may put the book down because time's up, but they won't be able to stop thinking about it. And that's what we all want as writers, isn't it? Someone who loves our story so much, they can't wait to get back to it. I have a 4th lesson. Look for places where we can include media literacy in our stories. Kids and teenagers today are bombarded with information. But what's the right information? How can they tell good sources from bad sources? I'm going to be asking this question in every book I write. How can I incorporate just a tiny little mention of media literacy in this story? Obviously, again, it won't work for every story, but for the ones where it does work, get it in there. The state of the world is up to our youth. Don't we want them to be critical thinkers? I sure do. And if I can be a part of facilitating that, I want to be. That's it for today's On My Shelf. If you're interested in hearing an author's perspective on books, movies, and sometimes TV shows, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.